Hello. In today's lecture, we are going to be looking at the work of Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu was a French sociologist and public intellectual and has influenced a range of fields from education to psychology, sociology obviously, anthropology, philosophy and much more. Last class, we talked about the work of Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman wrote about face-to-face interactions and how a series of staged performances basically create the social field, right? With Bourdieu, we are looking at what are the structures that enable particular performances, what influences our attitudes, and how do we form our belief systems, and what structures our actions. So these are the kind of questions that we seek to understand with Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu's life also in many ways reflects and is a precursor to the kind of questions he himself asks. So his life, I would say, is an illustration of some of his key concepts. So let's begin with looking at what his life was like. Very briefly though, I'll not spend too much time over it. He was born in 1930 in rural France, in a kind of remote area of France where the people from that area had a particular accent and were easily recognizable, and that particular accent was not very high up in the social hierarchy. He's also lived through the Nazi occupation of France. He was very young at that point. His father was a peasant turned postman, but really encouraged Bourdieu to seek higher education. So Bourdieu was able to get enrolled in a prestigious school first, and then eventually for university he went to École Normale Supérieure, one of the most prestigious universities in France. He was also drafted into military service and deployed in Algeria during the time of the Algerian War of Independence, and so has offered very deep insights into Algerian life. He stayed on after the war and taught at a college in Algeria, and his experience in Algeria also has been key to shaping many of the insights that he offers us as social theorists. After he came back from the Algerian War, in fact, he first visits the United States, where he also meets Erving Goffman, the theorist we studied last class, and he is starting to see that the academic field in France is dominated by structuralists. Erving Goffman, on the other hand, is also asking us to pay attention to seeing humans as agents, as those who stage performative actions, how these performances take shape through face-to-face interactions. So from Goffman, he is also deriving the notion of agency. From his work in Algeria, he writes an ethnography of Algerian life, which becomes very popular. But then when he comes back, he writes one of the books that I am largely going to be speaking about today, Outline of a Theory of Practice. And we'll also speak briefly about Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. Both of these works became very significant in multiple disciplines. He was appointed professor of sociology at Collège de France. This itself was a hugely prestigious position that he occupied for a large part of his career, and continued to write and shape not just French but also social theory once his books were translated in many parts of the world. His other books are Homo Academicus, The Logic of Practice, The Field of Cultural Production, and much more. He wrote about 24 books. In fact, if you look at the title of the book that we are talking about today, Outline of a Theory of Practice, it says outline, right? So in this book, he is basically laying out an outline or an idea, right, about what he thinks about theory and practice, a theory of practice, of the doing of social science, of the making of social theory. But through his other works, he continues to develop what he had laid out in Outline of a Theory of Practice. He passes away in 2002 and has left behind immense number of essays, writings both in the formal academic journals and books, but also for the larger public. He was, towards the end of his life, very critical of neoliberalism and globalization, although we are not going to go into some of a lot of that work of his. When he came back from Algeria, French academia largely had people grappling with this one question: how are social inequality and power structures reproduced across generations without evident coercion? So, ideas of enlightenment, ideas of democracy and freedom and progress were quite pervasive in French society of the time. And yet, despite the non-existence of an authoritative monarch, it was still evident that social hierarchies are reproducing themselves, have still not vanished. So this question was something that several scholars grappled with, and there were two huge ways of thinking about this in France at the time. And one was largely the structuralists. The main primary famous figure of that is the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the other school that in fact challenged what the structuralist was saying was existentialism, and here the key figure was Jean-Paul Sartre. So in this particular slide, what I've tried to do is show you the academic field or the field of ideas that Bourdieu is inhabiting and that he is in conversation with. So let's take a few moments to look at what he is drawing from where, and one could say in many ways that Bourdieu is a great synthesizer of different ways of producing knowledge and thinking about the social world, and that he has derived his ideas from seemingly contradictory positions, but through his ideas we have a more nuanced and a richer way of looking at the social world. So from Marx, for example, he takes the idea of capital as central to the reproduction of power and power hierarchies, but then he expands the idea of capital as not merely economic capital, but also capital to include other forms such as social capital, symbolic capital, cultural capital, and so on. Then from Weber, he looks at how hierarchies are produced, how we give forms of authority to particular persons or organizations, how our organizations work. And in some ways, one could say that he brings together the more economic structural aspect or the capital aspect from Marx with the notions of meaning, symbolism associated with authority from Weber, and he combines that to formulate his theory. From Durkheim also can be seen as a structuralist. He takes the idea of a social fact, and a social fact as that which structures human social life. In fact, he often calls social fact as, when he writes, he's calling it objective reality. Now, at that time, Claude Lévi-Strauss is a very prominent structuralist anthropologist, and Bourdieu is drawing from Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss, Marcel Mauss, also a structuralist, but then also is very influenced by Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was a philosopher who studied language, and he's coined the term language games. Now, games is also a metaphor that Bourdieu uses a lot. Bourdieu was also a rugby player, and so many of the ways in which he's explaining his ideas of habitus, of the field, are drawing from his understanding of how we play inside a game, right? Firstly, a game has rules, such as Wittgenstein would say language is rules, but we don't always think about these rules as we are speaking. They come somewhat intuitively, instinctively to us. Now, this seemingly naturalness or instinct is actually socially produced, is what Bourdieu would argue. So, in the playing field, for example, we take the rules, we also improvise on those rules. So, he's drawing that notion of a structure which is improvisable from Wittgenstein, from the other structuralists, and by adding in this improvisational bit, by adding in human agency, meaning, subjectivity, he's bringing in the existentialists also into his way of working with a theory on human action. While at university, he was also taught by Louis Althusser, who is also a Marxist structuralist. Althusser was also grappling with that question that I had positioned up front in this lecture on how are hierarchies being reproduced, and Althusser had written about the ideological state apparatus. So Bourdieu's also learned from that. His contemporaries are Michel Foucault, his teacher was Louis Althusser, his contemporary was also Jacques Derrida. So a very, very intellectually intense academic field is what he inhabits and is writing in. His accent, his rural belongings are also shaping how he understands that particular academic field. And while he is very successful in it, he's always aware of where he's coming from, right? And that, I think, plays a huge role in how he speaks or writes about notions such as habitus that we are going to be looking at in this lecture. Forgot to mention Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He's taken the idea of embodied phenomenology and paying attention to body, paying attention to the meaning we attach to our bodily actions, all of that from him. So again, a lot of influences and a lot of intellectual thinkers that he is in conversation with. I will spend some time going through many of his ideas, especially the ones that have been very influential in shaping social theory. And the first one being practice. Now, in his idea of practice, he brings together the notion of structure as given by the structuralist and the notion of agency or meaning as being talked about by scholars who give eminence to the notion of agency and also to the existentialists who are looking at subjective meaning. He's also using practice to include both ideas such as that which is in habitual practice, such as ritual, or this is the local practice, the way we use it, but also the sense of how we repeatedly do some things to get practice, right? You keep practicing a good handwriting in order to acquire a good handwriting. So the act of repetition produces that. He argues that there are some things that we are not quite conscious of. There are structures that we are not quite conscious of that shape how we act and that is how we practice in the social world. And the other thing he points out is that we often tend to believe that our actions are consequences of our strategic planning, our strategic thinking, whereas these actually might have a whole lot of other historical contingencies and structural influences that are shaping them. Let me read out from, in fact, he quotes Marx in his introduction to the outline for a theory of practice, and I want to read that out. He writes from Karl Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, he quotes, "The chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of an object of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practiced not subjectively. All social life is essentially practical," Marx writes. "All mysteries which lead theory towards mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice." So basically what Marx is trying to argue here, and Bourdieu would very much agree with him, is that you cannot just philosophize without looking at concrete practice. You cannot just build theory without engaging in the empirics of the real world. So he really wants to have something which bridges metaphysics or philosophy with anthropology. He wants to bring together abstract social theory with deeply embodied ethnographic practice. In the introduction to the translation of an outline of a theory of practice, Richard Nice writes, "A reflection of scientific practice which will disconcert both those who reflect on the social sciences without practicing them and those who practice them without reflecting on them." So he's critiquing both the abstract theorist, right, the high theory but no engagement with on the ground practice, and those who are basically just doing ethnographic work but not really generalizing or abstracting from it to produce theory. So you need to not go into any of these two extremes but to bring them together. Through this understanding, he's also coming to studying the doing of sciences, the doing of social science as a practice. and he introduces the idea of a point of view, right? So when as a theorist, as a philosopher, you stand outside the milieu and have a point of view that is considered to be outside the milieu, Bodo would say that that is without engagement and therefore is basically a position of immense privilege, and the only thing that is offering you is a synoptic illusion, an illusion that you can be outside, this understanding that you can be outside. Now, this is something, if you want to relate to it in a simple practice, is, for example, if you are an upper caste, then you don't really see caste. So you could make a offhand statement saying, well, caste no longer exists in India, right? But when you are not of an upper caste, then you tend to notice and experience discrimination such that you wouldn't be able to make such a statement. So Bodo in his introduction writes, the practical privilege in which all scientific activity arises never more subtly governs that activity than when unrecognized as privilege. All dominant classes often kind of act as if there is a certain outside view that they are presenting, and he says this is very much a privileged position. It leads to an implicit theory of practice, which is the corollary of neglect of the social conditions in which science is possible. So this too was Bodo's immense contribution to the doing of social sciences, is that we need to also understand the historical contingencies and the social structures which has made the doing of our science possible. Now let's come to some more of his ideas. I already mentioned that he expanded the understanding of Marx's notion of capital as that which accumulates, that historically can be accumulated, by going beyond the economic capital, which is primarily wealth or other means of production such as property, to also include social capital. Now, by social capital, he refers to the networks that we are able to form, who we know, how much we know them, how well we know them, how close are we to those that occupy positions of power. A good example for that could be, supposing you're looking for an internship and your mother knows another professor somewhere who can possibly offer you that internship. So this interaction, this engagement could lead you to acquire an internship, which maybe have not been possible for somebody who doesn't know the person, right? So you had a form of social capital that resulted in your being able to acquire a particular position. So that's an example of social capital. We also use it in understanding gendered social relations in the corporate world or in academia by referring to what is called as the old boys network. Is like a lot of senior men in higher positions knowing each other very well, such that it is their students who end up getting offers or jobs because of being interconnected in that network. Then he talked about cultural capital. Cultural capital, he says, can be embodied such as through our accent, through our tastes, through the kind of how we carry ourselves, through our composure, through how we speak, how we act in particular situations, the mannerisms that we adopt. And that cultural capital can also be in the form of material objects, such as the art we acquire or the kind of house we build for ourselves to reflect our identity. And then it is also institutionalized through, let's say, the kind of the institutions we attend. So usually when we ask somebody and they say they went to Harvard or they went to the IIT, there's a kind of cultural capital that is embedded in the names of these institutions, and that embeddedness he also refers to as symbolic capital. Economic capital is clear, it's the wealth and property and material ownership that he's referring to. I've put up here a painting, again reflecting, like sitting at the dining table, how you eat, do you use a fork and a spoon, and how you dress. In his book, Distinction, he speaks about the notion of taste, how the working class might have acquired tastes that are of food that is filling, that is wholesome, that is nutritional but not very expensive, and it might be in large quantities because they need to eat that much in order to be work and perform bodily labor. Whereas on the other hand, the food of the elite might be decorated in might be smaller servings, exotic flavors, laid out in a particular way, and oftentimes it is also tastes that you need to perhaps acquire and may not be something that is very commonly available. So through what somebody is eating, through how they are eating, through how they are speaking, to how they carry themselves, all of that can translate into capital. And now these capital, various forms of capital are also translatable into each other through, particular acquired tastes, or through how you carry yourself, what kind of art you like. You can meet other people who are like you, they are people like us. We often make these statements. And so through that expand our social capital. Through social capital, we can acquire jobs, or we can acquire roles in businesses, such as becoming CEOs or board members of corporations, and through that process maybe acquire wealth. So these different capitals are interchangeable. They lead from one to the other, and through this process then Bodo argues that hierarchies are reproduced, right? So it's not explicitly just the ownership of means of production, but it is all of this that contributes to the social reproduction of societal hierarchies. All of these capitals translate in a more material form, in an embodied form, as what he refers to as habitus. Now, habitus is the sphere that we inhabit. Let me just actually read out the definition that he writes. Systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. Now, he writes in this seemingly convoluted way. His book is pretty dense, I must agree with that. But the idea is fairly simple. There are structures that structure our actions, and through what we do, we are actually reproducing those very structures. But we also improvise. So, that is as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of operations necessarily in order to attain them. Right? Let me explain that simply and then also through an example. So, dispositions are those actions or inclinations that are taken for granted. They are, he also uses the game metaphor to say feel for the game. I have a feel for the game. No, I have a feel for this place. I know intuitively how to act in that. I might enter a corporate boardroom and feel totally at ease sitting at one of the chairs at the desk. On the other hand, I might also enter it not very used to that particular place, and then always feel awkward or uncomfortable, and not then therefore so confident about voicing my own perspective or views on the discussion that is ongoing. We've all kind of felt these imposter syndrome kind of things. I think the imposter syndrome in some ways captures quite well, in a more colloquial sense, what he means by whether we feel out of place or whether we feel part of that habitus. So, dispositions are taken for granted, tacit tendencies, propensities, inclinations, practical sense, our tastes, our very commonsensical understandings, things we take for granted. And then he says, habitus contributes to the production and reproduction of the existing social order. But it does so invisibly, because we kind of think of them as natural. I am a natural, I am a natural at this, I am a natural performer, we forget that what we understand as natural is actually socially produced through simple invisible things like dining table conversations, through who our parents know, through our observing of the people around us. So, they are not explicitly taught to us as in schools or institutions, but these are things that we absorb from our environment. He writes, each agent, wittingly or unwittingly, willy-nilly, is a producer and reproducer of objective meaning. Here the objective meaning is the social fact that exists. So, while we are constantly acting with a sense of that structure that surrounds us, we are also improvising. We are also doing strategic thinking. Okay, if I say this, then that person will say this, so maybe I should act in this way. So these are the kind of thoughts that make a particular action possible. All of this comes together in the idea of habitus. Now, there are different fields through which these habituses also become evident. A field is a network or a set of actors where each one is aware of the structure but is also acting strategically and in competition with each other. So there is collaboration and competition, and everyone is acting in order to gain more prominence, in order to gain more power. So such as the academic field slide that I showed, the academic field in which Budo is acting. You can also think of field in terms of a particular school or the culture industry, the media industry. You can think of politics as a field, a religious group, and obviously the sports field, where you are into the field, right? You're in the field, you have a feel for the game. In fact, for the word feel for the game, for that which is common sensical knowledge in that particular field, he uses the term doxa. And for the idea that we are all invested in the game in such a way that we play with our wholeheartedness, right? We know it's a game, but we give our totality to it. If we have to win, then we have to do whatever it takes to win, right? So this total giving into that and into play the game is the notion of illusio. He writes, a field is a network or a configuration of objective relations between positions, and we all understand that relation, right? The structure of the field is a state of the distribution of the specific capital which governs the chances of success in that field. So there is a structure, and we are all playing within that structure, but we are also doing strategic thinking, and through that we are improvising, and through that then we are also sometimes, although rarely, producing a shift in that structure. So here again we can go back to the language metaphor, for example. While we understand language as a structure, it gives us the syntax, there is a grammar, there is a way of speaking, but then we also develop things like, how do you say things more eloquently or more beautifully, which is not necessarily part of a taught grammar. While there is a received structure, things don't always mean the same all the time. So for example, the word manuscript, for example. A manuscript referred to a handwritten text at some point. But then with the coming of computers and the way we publish books right now, a published book which is printed in a machine is also called a manuscript now. A computer, let's take the example of the word computer. At one point, it was human beings who acted as calculators that were often referred to as computers. And now we know that we call a machine which does these calculations and as a computer. So meanings can change over a large period of time or through sudden disruptions, but largely we operate within a structure. So through these logics, he is trying to combine and in some ways resolve what is often called within sociology the structure agency debate. And this has been one of his most important contributions to the field of social theory. So now, having looked at Budo's concept and his understanding of the various forms of capital that can transform into each other, I want to come back to the Indian context and look at Ajanta Subramaniam's book, The Caste of Merit. In this book, she talks about how the notion of merit, she critically looks at the notion of merit to show how caste privilege transforms into the notion of merit, or how merit, the idea of merit itself, conceals social privilege, caste privilege. This is a very simple idea. I mean, take it as one is the formal education that we think that most people have the possibility to receive. But apart from the formal education, there are dining table conversations, there are the exposure to the various art forms, theatre, literature, scientific ideas, things that we subconsciously imbibe and learn basically through the environment that we inhabit. Now, caste also privileges the upper castes in similar ways. However, as Satish Deshpande has talked about, that caste, that social capital and cultural capital in the form of caste is often converted into what we now know as modern capital. He uses the term modern capital as the kind of the so-called meritorious achievement. It is looked at as a personal achievement, as the notion of high intelligence or hard work, the idea of the self-made man, whereas many of these are coming from an inherited social cultural capital. In the caste of merit, Ajanta Subramaniam looks at the IITs, particularly starting off with IIT Madras, and shows us how what we see as meritocracy, as merit, as something that is coming to us through our own hard work, through our inherent and inherited talent and intellectual ability, actually is socially reproduced through histories of how caste was produced and articulated and hierarchized in the pre-colonial and then in the colonial and in the post-colonial periods in Indian history. She shows how, for example, as a caste, Shudras in pre-colonial India were considered the kind of, what we would call as engineers. They would craft excellent footwear, they would plan and build magnificent buildings and structures. But then in the colonial era, it was the Brahmanical castes, and because of their textual knowledge, who were privileged and they entered into bureaucracies, and eventually when it came to establishing colleges or institutions of engineering education in the country, then the Brahmanical castes were privileged. And not just this, it's a big story that she tells through historical analysis, that how caste and the notion of merit become intertwined in the way the IITs were shaped and continue to shape our social reality today, not just in India but also globally. We'll speak more about caste in our next lecture when I will introduce the work of Ambedkar, but for today, thank you.